So today we're making 3 different ornaments, and I'm going to start with the avocado because it'll teach you some basic skills that you can use for the other 2 ornaments. And what I've done so far is I've just cut out the different pieces of the patterns for the avocado, which is these 3 pieces. And you have 2 options from here. You could use your chalk to outline the different pieces and then cut, or the pieces are so small that especially for this little circle, I'm just going to hold it and cut because A, it doesn't have to be perfect, and B, it's just going to save me some time and effort, and I'm all for that. So, you know, I'm being relatively careful. I'm just using household scissors that are reasonably sharp. But if you have fabric scissors or something, that will work too. So for these bigger pieces, I think it will be reasonable to still keep the same approach. You just want to be mindful that you're holding on tight enough that the pattern isn't slipping around and that you are able to just hold it tight. Again, does not have to be perfect, and if there's a sharp edge or something, I can just come here and fix it a little bit. For my darker green pieces, they're pretty big, so I might just do a quick outline. Keeping in mind that I'm going to be cutting inside the outline because the chalk is going pretty far outside the paper. So that just allows me to know that right inside the chalk is where I want to be cutting. And even though you're going to be matching this up to the other green piece, still does not have to be perfect. You'll figure it out. So there's one. The next thing about felt is there isn't a wrong or right side. You can use either side of the fabric. It's also not going to crease, so there's no ironing involved. All right, so now I've cut out my pattern pieces, and I'm going to set the dark green pieces aside for now, and I'm just going to work with the brown circle and the lighter green color. So I'm going to use this kind of brownish color to begin with, and I'm just cutting a piece that's workable because you won't need too much to go around the brown, and if you need more, you can just cut another piece off. But you don't want something so long that you can't really manage it. So I'm just pulling the thread through so that it won't come off. And then how I'm going to tie it off is just to send it through the brown circle and then tie a double knot, just because you know it's going to be secure and it's a relatively easy way to tie off at the beginning. All right, so I have my double knot, and I'm just going to trim the string. I can cut it the rest of the way later. So what I'm going to do, you'll see that it's pretty big, and that's because we're going to stuff this piece. It'll get a little smaller as we go just because it'll round out a bit. So keeping that in mind, you might want to set it off center just a tad with a little more room on this side that you're starting on, because this will kind of scrunch up once you have stuffed it a bit. So you know, just a tad. And I'm going to send my needle straight through from the top of the brown through the green and pull all the way through. And then I'm just going to continue in this way, pushing up either through the brown or the green, but I'd prefer the brown just because it's a bit easier. So I'm going up through the brown and then down through the green, so that I'm kind of creating a little stripe, if you will. And you don't have to put them so close together that it's going to take you an eternity to get around the circle. But you also want to be mindful that you're stuffing this, and if there's any big areas without any stitches, the stuffing might start to come through and it won't look good. So as far as how far into the brown I'm stitching, I'm staying as close as I can to the edge without the risk of kind of ripping the felt right at the edge. So maybe you can see here, I mean, small, but at the same time, not too small of a stitch. And I think it's nice starting off that the thread's a little different of a color, just because you can keep track of it. And since you're starting with this one, you can just, I mean, it'll blend enough that you won't notice it once it's done, but at the same time, it's not completely invisible, so you can see your work and what you're working on. So once I get far enough around the circle that it could start holding stuffing, you'll want to do that. But also, I'm just kind of pushing in because I'm sort of creating what will be a pouch. So it's kind of hard to predict where that fabric will stay once it's stuffed, but I'm just kind of pushing in a little bit to make a bit of a pouch. Also, it's not the worst thing to go around a little quickly the first time and then come around a second time in between your stitches. If you'd prefer to do it that way. So the piece of thread that I have is actually probably more than enough to get me around. Now I'm about halfway. Oops, that'll happen. Just need to thread the needle. So it could be that you get some knots in your string or something. If that happens, just try to untie it, obviously, if it's reasonable to do so. But if the knots aren't going to come out, just make sure that the thread's kind of tied off towards the end, and you can just cut your string and start again because it's not that big of a deal. So now I'm, as you can see, almost around the circle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab some stuffing. Just, you know, a small amount. I don't want it to be huge, but I just want people to know that this is a seed, basically. So it'll have a little bit of a shape. So just start with a little bit and then add and see what you like. So obviously it won't be a semicircle coming out this way like a real seed, but it's good to give it some dimension. All right, so you'll have some stuffing coming out, but if you could just push it in as much as possible and then just continue around the circle. And if your seed doesn't end up directly in the center, you know, it'll be all right. Now what I'm doing is, just because of the nature of how it's stuffed, you are going to want to be mindful because you'll have to gather it a bit. So even if it's not corresponding one-to-one on how far, do you know what I mean? If you push this flat, it's not going to push flat anymore because I stuffed it. So now instead of pushing these together, I'm just going up from under, and then I'm just kind of seeing how the needle naturally goes through the green and the brown so that it's going to kind of gather together and make sure that all the fabric is sewn up. And as you come to the end, I'm going to actually, like, there's a good hoop here. So I'm just going to do straight into the middle so that I can divide that up evenly and then go backwards and just hit the part that I missed here, just so that I don't have a big bubble right at the end. I mean, I still kind of do, so that's fine. And I might just need a few extra stitches here because of those little bubbles. All right, so that's looking pretty good. So now that I'm at the end, I'm going to turn my work over. And if you've ever tied off before, you'll know how this works, but basically I'm sending my needle under a stitch, pulling, and then it'll create a loop, and I'm just pulling my needle and my thread through that loop. And I'm going to do that twice just to make sure that it's tied off. And then pulling my needle off and sticking it somewhere safe. Cutting the thread fairly close to the end, and the same on the front. If you still have a little tail, then you're cutting that one too. So now I'm done with my first piece. Now what I'm going to do is put the smaller green piece on the bigger green piece, just one of them, and I'm going to do the same thing here, except you're not stuffing it. So same stitch, just little loops all the way around. So I'm just going to take some green thread this time, and you might not make it all the way around this time with just one piece of thread, so that's perfectly okay. So again, I'm just threading my needle, and then I'm going to pick a part of the avocado to just send the needle through and double knot. You could also just double knot your thread and then pull the thread through from the back to the front, but I just don't want to risk the knot pulling through the fabric, if you know what I mean. So that's why I like to tie off on felt like this, because I just know that that's secure. If I hide it under here, hopefully it'll stay and I just won't have a tail to deal with. Otherwise you can just cut it short. So I'm just trying to center this as well as possible. And then again, just going through the light green to the dark green, and then just kind of going around my work. So I think it's best to always go from the inside to the outside, because as you can see, I didn't right here. And when you go from the outside to the inside, it tends to pull the felt with it. So I really think it's best to come up through both and then go down outside, because it'll maintain your shape best. And this one, since you're not stuffing it, you can kind of spread your stitches a little wider. You don't want them super wide, because after you stuff the center with both green pieces, it'll be curved. So you do want it to be intact, but you don't need to be so careful with this piece. So I'll come back when I'm done with this. All right, so now I have my 3 pieces all together. It's starting to look a little bit like an avocado. And now I'm just going to take my last piece and put it right on top and just make sure that I have the right sides together, meaning that they match up. And then I'm taking my dark green thread, just take a piece. So just pay attention to this one, because the stitch is a bit different, and this is what you'll be using on the other 2 ornaments. You actually will not use the stitch that you've been using for the rest of this, but you'll be using what's called a blanket stitch. So I'm going to start by threading my needle, and now I'll just start off in the way that I have for the other 2 pieces by tying a couple of knots. All right, so this time what I'm doing, and it's very similar to what you've just been doing, but with one extra step. So I'm sending my needle from the front to the back, again, just, you know, fairly close to the edge. But this time what I'm doing is, once there's a loop, much like when you've been tying off, is you're just sending your thread through that. And I need to cut my tail because it's very much in the way. All right, so again, I'm sending my needle straight up through both pieces of fabric, and then back down through that loop that there is. So I'm just going to go all the way around, and this step especially, you don't want to separate your stitches too wide because stuffing will come through. But I mean, I'm still doing reasonably large stitches. So you're just going to go all the way around in this fashion. And ideally, the loop will create a line going between the middle of the 2 fabrics as to keep some of that stuffing in better. So I'm not going to worry about stuffing until I am almost all the way around. So I'm just going to continue like this, listen to a podcast, and come back to you when I'm ready to stuff. All right, so as you can see, I'm almost all the way around. I just have this little pocket to work with. So I'm just going to, again, take small pieces of stuffing and just push them at first all the way to the top and then down. And I don't want a ball really, so I'm not going to stuff it to the brim until it can't possibly take any more stuffing. I just want it to retain a shape really. So I'm just going to, piece by piece, little by little, put some stuffing in there. And you'd be surprised actually how much stuffing this thing will take, because I mean, as long as you keep pushing, it'll keep taking it really. But so I just want it to be a bit rounded, maybe add a little bit more, and then I don't want to fill it so tight that it's hard to finish sewing, so I'm just going to push that in, and if I need to put a little bit more once I'm all the way around, I can, but I'm just going to continue. And I've actually made it around with my original piece of thread, so that's nice. I haven't had to deal with tying off anything, but it wouldn't be a huge deal if I did. Okay, so as I come closer, I'm just assessing if this is really how much stuffing I want, because it's getting close to the time when I can't go back. So just adding a little into the part where I just stitched. All right, I think that's good. So I'm just going to finish up. If there are little white pieces all over the place, that's okay. You can deal with that later. Also, it helps not to fill it to the brim, because then you don't have stuffing trying to poke out of every single little stitch you ever made. All right, so I'm getting back to where I started, and I'm just going to go one stitch beyond where I started, because then I am overlapping, which is nice. Okay, now I'm just going to tie off. So I'm going through a stitch I already made and going through it, and then the same thing again. Just in the exact same spot, and then I'm cutting that close. All right, so there, and I can just kind of do this to even out the stuffing. All right, so I have my piece of ribbon, and what I'm going to do is take my scissors and cut a really sharp angle, meaning a steep triangle, if you will, like this, so that I can fit something through the eye of my needle. Now it's gonna look ugly, but that's all right. I just need it to stay for one little stitch. So I'm just going to go through the top of my little guy here, pull the ribbon through. Might be a little tough. All right, it wasn't pretty, but it made it. So then I'm just cutting off the little piece of frayed ribbon, pulling the pieces of ribbon until they're even, and then I'm just tying a single knot at the top. And now I've completed my first ornament. All right, so I've skipped ahead here because basically to make the cactus, it's the exact same blanket stitch as you just did for the avocado. So basically you're just going to cut out the two green pieces of felt according to the pattern, and then sandwich them together and start doing your blanket stitches. Now, you just have to be careful that you're stuffing as you go when you do the cactus, because if you get down here and you haven't stuffed any of this, it's gonna be kind of hard to go back and do that. So with your pinky or with a pencil, you're just going to want to make sure that you have stuffing all the way up in there so that your cactus has a nice shape. So now I'm just going to show you how to put the flower on the top. So I have my strip, and I'm definitely not going to use this whole thing, but what I'm going to do is make cuts down the fabric like this, and I'm going more than halfway, but I don't want it to come apart. So I'm just making little cuts, and I can always make them deeper, but I can't make them less deep. So, and I'm making them pretty close together, but you can just see what's right for you. They definitely don't have to be the same distance apart. And again, this is going to be way too long. But basically, what I'm going to do is just make a really small center and then just roll this until I have a little flower. And already after a few rolls, I'm thinking, okay, that's probably going to be all I need. If I don't like how the flower looks, I can go back and cut the little strips a bit thinner or something, but I'm just cutting that off there, so I don't need to use that as my final roll up. I just wanted to see about, and I have some extra strings here, I just wanted to be able to approximate how long I'm going to want it, and I still might cut it a little shorter. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually working with my lime green again. I'm not using too much thread just because I don't need that much and I don't want it to be in my way. All right, so I'm going to put the flower on the shorter of the little arms here, so I'm just going to tie off to the cactus because it's easier. Just doing my double knot here. Cutting the ends. All right, so now I'm taking my pink piece again and just rolling it. I don't want it to be too thick because then it's going to be hard to sew. Basically, it's gonna have the tendency to come up in the middle, which is fine because it'll actually shape the flower nicely, but you don't want it to be too extreme because then it's going to be hard to sew everything together. But my first stitch is just going to be making sure that I'm going through every piece of felt. Oops, and I lost my thread. All right. So again, I'm just going through every piece of felt, so I'm kind of high up. And then just placing it where I want it, right at the top, and then going through the top of that cactus arm, pulling tight. And as I'm pulling tight, I'm just making sure that everything is where it should be. And then I'm going through the flower again, hopefully not through my thumb, and back through the top of the cactus. I'm not going through the exact top of the cactus, it's all right. Just approximating. And basically now I'm just trying to kind of zigzag so that the whole flower is staying on the cactus. So I don't want just one piece attached, I want the whole flower to stay on there. All the way to the edge. And if I'm at the edge, I might just kind of attach it a little closer to the inside so that it forms a little bit of a better shape. But I don't know, nothing has to be perfect, right? Just trying to make sure that it's good and on there. All right, so once you've hit either side and you're confident that your flower is attached and it's not going anywhere, like you can kind of see here, I've got stitches up and down this whole thing. I don't think it's going anywhere, so I'm just going to actually go through the edge of my cactus arm to tie off. And do that a couple times. And then cut the string. Okay, so now all that's left to do is attach the ribbon in exactly the same way as you did with the avocado. So you're just gonna, again, cut the ribbon at an angle, thread it through, pull it through the top, tie it off, and you're all done with this one. And now you can move on to the taco.